So, from the last section, we understood that the fact that God he had to create that which is natural first, then that which is spiritual, it was represented inside Jacob and Esau. The blessing, though entitled to Esau, it would first come to Jacob, then later on, through the breaking of the yoke, it will come to Esau. This is exactly what happened. And this is exactly what had happened during our creation. We created natural men for a purpose of resurrecting our spirit, that is, for a purpose of creating of a superior people who would understand God from a spiritual perspective, who would understand God after that their dead had been resurrected. So it was speaking to eras of creation. First in the process, that which is earthly, then later on, that which is spiritual and eternal. So, coming to these two brothers, because these two brothers explained a lot of things, of the things that we didn't know, of the things that God had actually formulated from creation. But however, to us, we needed this preaching, we needed this sort of dramatical representation of the things. We needed it to be acted out so that we can actually receive more understanding concerning the purpose of God. And the purpose of God here enshrined in the two brothers, it was also going to tell us a special relationship between the two. First, that which is spiritual is going to be a servant of that which is natural. Jacob was going to be the Lord blessed and monitoring the blessing. During that era in time, Esau is then supposed to be his servant. And later on, when the blessing had been gathered and the bands had broken, or the yoke had been broken off from Esau, Esau was going to be liberated. Esau was then going to be his true self, that is spiritual, that is superior, that is, we would have come out of an era which is natural, of understanding God through earthly demonstrations or through earthly practices, through vain practices, either through our knowledge or our practices themselves. That is, we were coming out of an era of religion, right? So that's basically what it means when they say resurrection of the dead. It's the last day for the religion, is the last day for coming from understanding God through things which are earthly. We are entering into the resurrection of our dead. We are entering into an eternal dispensation. We are entering into a dispensation which is spiritual. So, the relationship that I've just explained concerning Esau being a servant at some point in time is trying to shed light into certain terms which are then used in the scriptures. First term that is being used in the scriptures concerns the words like love, right? First, you are going to hear the ministration of the apostles reminding they which have received the blessing, that is, of formulating or of modeling a spiritual Israel. They were then admonished or reminded, extolled to say, men and brethren, forget not to love your brother. If you love your brother, God would love you. In that case, they are simply being told that, remember, you are still earthy. Love that which is spiritual. Interpret to the resurrection of your spirit. And when your spirit is resurrected, you are then going to be able to relate with God. You are then going to be able to be loved of God. That is. So also, you are going to see that besides the word love, a term like charity will be used. Charity in this case is actually simply used to enlighten another relationship. Because remember, being a servant, Esau is going to have nothing. He's going to have less, right? And by that, when then the blessing is given to him, it's almost a form of a work of charity. So charity is because the spirit would be a servant while least we have a natural understanding of godliness. The Spirit had nothing of understanding of God, because we are using natural things to preach to each other or to understand God through that which is natural. That during that time, the Spirit is a servant. The Spirit doesn't have. And when we then give to our spirit an ordered message, that one message, that form of a message which is a priesthood, that which would resurrect our brother, our spirit, we are said to perform an act of charity. That's why then you will hear charity as a superior commandment. If we perform charity, we would have performed a superior commandment. By loving our brother, we are fulfilling the purpose of God. By performing charity, we are performing a higher level of accepting the things of God or of obedience, because that's exactly what God wants or seek to achieve. By us being earthy, we are supposed to give out of charity, seeing that God hath blessed us. God hath multiplied the thing which is spiritual through that which is natural. God hath blessed us abundantly in giving us all forms of religion across the earth. And in all those forms of religion, there lies a peace which we then are supposed to gather together, refine, order it, and then give to our spirit. And the gathering of these men, the gathering of religions together, the gathering of that understanding which is yet locked inside religions together, would bring out the resurrection of the dead, would awaken our dead brother. So that's basically what God wanted for us to know in bringing these terms. So the other thing that I also want us to know concerning the relationship between Esau and Jacob is the fact that Esau himself, he is not really an enemy to God. What's enmity to God is his propensity to go to God being dead, right? Being not yet resurrected. Or in other terms, we are speaking of us trying to God without us having fulfilled the gathering of the blessing together, or ordering the blessing together, to then activate the resurrection of our dead so that we can go to God. If we then go to God straight without us having gathered, without us having ordered the blessing, without us having first activated or resurrected our dead, that is an act which is going to constitute iniquity. That is the act that God would not love concerning Esau. Then when that God says, Esau have I hated, that's what he meant. He meant to say, I hate you coming to me with a dead spirit. I hate you coming to me before the resurrection of the dead. You should understand that before the resurrection of the dead, you are still working towards the resurrection of the dead, right? Or in simpler terms, your faith is still toward God, because these doctrines, they intertwine. They are intertwined in their trying to explain the things of God. They are intertwined. It's a complex, right? Okay. What I want us to know now is the answer which was then given of God to Jacob concerning Esau, when he then said, he wanted to understand why then God would start with that which is earthly, then that which is spiritual. Why then God would love Jacob and hate Esau, right? This was done much more portrayed in the book of Malachi. I'm going to read the book of Malachi, the first scriptures wherein Jacob asked God, because that's exactly how the chapter would start. Let me read from chapter 1, just a few scriptures, 1 and 2 and 3 verses. Okay, let me read from verse 1. The burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. I have loved you, said the Lord. Yet you say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord? Yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau, and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. Right? So Jacob had this in mind to say, why then would God love me? Why then would God seek to establish that which is earthy first and then that which is spiritual later? Or simply, why God starting by creating us natural, right? So God would then answer this, because this is the answer in the same book of Malachi, chapter 2, verse 15. Yeah, let me read verse 15. It reads, "And did not he make one, yet had he the residue of the Spirit? And wherefore one? That he might seek a godly seed. Therefore take heed to yourself, to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously against the wife of his youth." Here God is emphasizing why he made one. That is why he first instructed that the blessing be gathered in one in Jacob. Why first that which is earthy? He is saying God sought a godly seed. God sought a seed out of Jacob, that which would actually resurrect Esau, which would actually attain unto the resurrection of the dead. That's why even when you are going to be reading the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 concerning the resurrection of the dead, seed is actually used more also as a representation from nature, explaining to men what it takes to resurrect him. It took the seed, and that seed would die, and then that which God sought for to have would resurrect unto life. That is, that which is spiritual would resurrect unto life, right? So that's what it meant. God sought the seed inside Jacob. God sought to perform inside Jacob the gathering of a priesthood which would actually resurrect the dead, which would actually propitiate for the sins, which is an ordered message, a strictly ordered message from the gathering of all men together unto God. So, having done what I've done so far, I just wanted maybe to state the recaps so that by these recaps you can then be able to follow the section which I want to add, or I mean a part of this section which I want to add concerning the resurrection of the dead. I want to explain where also it was simplified rather by God through religions, right? So the blessing would start from that which is natural, and then that which is spiritual. That which is natural is limited. It won't understand godliness, because remember, his realities are bound to his nature. He is a man of the earth. Therefore, his realities are bound within that which is natural. Therefore, he is far from God. He cannot relate with God. God is far, God is spiritual. Until otherwise, his spirit is going to be resurrected. Then he is going to be able to then relate with God and relate to God according to the law, according to that which had been taught inside the living, or according to that which had been modeled inside what? The living, right? So, the living, that is all of us as we were born of Adam, we are then entitled to labor, all of us, to then learn first from our nature, second from what nature has done to us, that is to make us differ or to diversify us across the globe, or to scatter us across the globe as we are scattered in different places. All those things are things done to us by our nature, nature trying to help us model that which is spiritual. Therefore, when we would have gathered all those things together, that which God is teaching inside nature, we're then going to resurrect our dead, who is closer to God, but yet not able to function or to relate with God, because he is still relying, waiting for that which went through that which is natural to come out of the natural, modeled for him to be able to understand, to relate with it, and then accepting it and relate with God in ways that are going to be fruitful, in ways that are going to be eternal, in ways that are never going to end, because that which is spiritual is ever going to be before God. So this is the part that I'm going to share with you. To understand all these things that I was trying to explain, I'm sure everyone who is going to be listening also to this part will get a chance to listen to the first part, wherein I introduced the doctrine of Jesus Christ, when I explained the fact that all men who are upon the earth were going to be practicing religions, that is, moving from one form of glory to another form of glory. These are forms of glory, which is they are representations of the true glory. So moving from that level of faith to another level of faith, it simply meant to say men were going to be indulged in vain activities or in natural understanding things, up until then they are going to be able to resurrect their dead, up until they are going to be able to be spiritual, right? And in those religions, I told you to say that each and every man or each and every religion has a part, a portion of the truth. As also said the prophets, Apostle Paul mentions and say, men would prophesy in part, men would know in part, men would understand in part. Men's portions are the limitations to his realities. That which is his portion, men would act in that portion, right? So we're also going to see that the African tradition has another portion of its own. The African tradition itself, people were meant to do the things inside the African tradition which were done by men through the inspiration of angels, and then they would be told, according to the African language, Vadzimu, or the angels, they would guide them through the procedures of what to be done, what is it that God required them to do inside their religion. As you know, religion is just a portrayal of that which is spiritual, right? So people would do things vainly, right? People would do things with ignorance of that which is spiritual, however, doing things the right way, however, preaching of things which are higher, things which are more superior and more complex for them to understand. That's basically what Africa was doing. So each and every one has a part. Like I said, we cannot despise any part. The living, that is the ministrations which were done of the apostles, that portion is another part. The ministrations which would also happen inside the Quran is another part. The ministrations which would happen in many other different places has a part. But the African tradition, it has a part which actually simplified the resurrection of the dead. So this maybe is an advantage to those who are Africans, but it's not really an advantage. Everyone will learn, right? The African tradition, I will explain the African tradition, then use the explanation that I'm going to give to show how much it was an enlightenment of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. So as Paul did when he came to Athens, he said, you are actually doing the things of God, but however you're doing them ignorantly. Or in other words, God gave you a witness of him, and in that witness you're actually supposed to see godliness. However, you can't see godliness because you're doing it ignorantly. The same applies when it comes to Africa as well. They which were learned in the doctrine, if they were to come to Africa, they would understand that the things that are done by Africans in all the activities and laboring inside religions, they are actually things of God, however portrayed through things which are vain, right? Yes, so the African tradition can be simplified by this. It's a people who were taught, instructed of angels, given a law saying, you are going to pray to God, but your prayers to God are not going to be going to God straight. Remember, you are the living. The living are far away from God. The living cannot get to God. The living have no access to God. The living only rely upon their dead for them to get to God. if their dead are going to be resurrected, then their dead are able to make intercession for them and make propitiation for them concerning all things that are done among the living. So the living would err, the living would trespass the law, but they would not go straight to God seeking propitiation for whatever that they would have done. They would rather invoke their dead, so that their dead are the ones that are going to lay it bare before God, because the dead are closer to God. Also, the dead would actually work hand in hand with the angels of God. So vadzimu and our dead would work in union so that they can deliver a message to God, our creator, our maker, or the one whom they called Musikavanhu, or Unkulunkulu in other dialects. I'm using Shona, which is my own dialect myself. So you are going to see that they also would say, when the dead have died, the living were supposed to labor so that they seek and sought by all the rites which were to be performed to resurrect their dead. They were going to perform all activities inside that African tradition, which included the waiting. You were supposed to wait for a certain period of time, and after that time have elapsed, you were then supposed to gather, all of you the living, from all different places. So if you had relatives which were maybe staying at a distant away from where you would be staying, or from the place of the dead, right? They would actually send and gather all the relatives, all they which belonged to the dead, all they which are related to the dead would gather. And after they gather, they would perform a lot of other activities, including the feasting, killing of beasts, and performing several rites, which were then just done for them to make sure that they perform the work as it was directed of the angels. And through those activities, eventually, if the work was done well, if the work would be accepted before God, it was the work which was supposed to resurrect their dead. And they were going to be given a sign, a signal concerning the fact that their dead have truly resurrected. So, I will speak in vernacular for now, in Shona. Saka, vanhu vese vaiungana kuti akafa wedu amuke. Kana akafa wedu amuka, ndiye ega anokwanisa kutitaurira kuna Mwari, ndiye anokwanisa kuziva nhamo dzedu, ndiye anoziva nezvedu zvakanyanya nokuti aimbogara nesu, zvakanyanya zvekare nekuti ndewedu, handiti isusu tiri vake. Pane oneness pamusoro pemupenyu neakafa, handiti. So back now, I would also want to mention to say, these who are dead, they actually would communicate to nature on behalf of the living. They would communicate to the earth itself being a deity of some sort, because the earth would actually intercede for those who are living. So you were supposed to live according to the law, but the law is bound to the earth, such that if you are going to err in the law, the earth would respond. So if you do something that is not allowed, if you transgress the law, if you continue in all those iniquities, the earth would actually revoke or invoke its anger to you. It would actually revoke certain benefits. For instance, it would revoke the rains, it would not produce, it would actually hold back whatever that you give or you sow to the ground. All those things would actually explain also the things of men communicating to God through nature, that is the earth, also guided by their dead, and the angels, vadzimu, right? So I have explained the African tradition. Now I will seek to enlighten that this, what I was explaining, is going to help you understand the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. So Africans in particular, the people of Zimbabwe, and or let me say they were of Southern and Central Africa. They're the ones whom I know specifically to be practicing this sort of religion. It was specific. It sought to give light to the resurrection of the dead. It says this: according to the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead we were created as the living, but the living are earthy and natural, therefore they cannot relate to God. So says also the African tradition: the living only relied upon their dead. However, our dead is the spirit, and this spirit is not yet functional, is still dead. So the living are supposed to then gather together, and when they gather together, the blessing, they would perform rites, they would order processions and rites before God, before the angels, and if that is going to be acceptable, then their dead were going to be resurrected. The same again with the purpose of God concerning the resurrection of the dead. We are supposed to gather the blessing inside the living, that is inside Jacob, and present it before God. And by ordering that understanding, our dead would resurrect. The African tradition explains it far much clearer than anyone else can try to explain it right now, because it's God who purposed it so that these who are of African descent would actually be able to understand the resurrection of the dead, and were supposed to preach this resurrection of the dead. After that, they have received the portion from the other men or from the other of their brethren who are scattered across the world. They would then know and understand that even that work which they were doing, it was of God. It explained the most complex doctrine, which even they, the apostles of that time, Apostle Paul, they actually struggled a lot to try to convince people about it, because people would not understand. It's a very complicated doctrine, however, very clear now that I've maybe explained it according to the African tradition. So they which are not Africans, they which are not of African descent, they will later on seek, I'm sure, maybe to just learn one or two things. There is nothing wrong in learning. As much as I learn myself of the Greek mythology, I learn of the Indian mythologies, I learn of the Jews, I learn also of the ministration of the apostles, because remember, all these have a part which we all need. However, all these parts, however scattered, they are all inside the doctrine. So I teach the doctrine, and the doctrine reconciles all these parts together. But here I'm giving you reference to a certain part which was with the Africans, so that you can have better understanding. So that maybe my explanation, being limited, maybe because I'm not English originally. I'm natively an African. I speak Shona, that's my first language. Here, explaining it in English, maybe possibly, I might miss one or two things. I can't be perfect in a language which is not mine, right? But I'm using it rather because I want to reach out. It's for the purpose of communicating. But that I'm sure quite well that it won't limit my understanding. It won't limit also they which are going to listen to me through these preachings. They are going to understand why then it was presented so to Africans. Maybe they can seek other avenues to learn about the African tradition. But still, it was just there to enlighten us concerning the doctrine. So that's good. So you're going to see that there are certain aspects that I've tried to explain in the introduction to the doctrine of Jesus, which I may maybe take occasion now that I've mentioned of the African tradition, which somewhat clarifies the purpose of men. Because remember, as I said, men were supposed to gather that which was represented as parts inside religions. When we gather them together, we are then going to facilitate the resurrection of our dead. It's the same again with the resurrection of the dead, as it was taught of the angels to the Africans, to say they would wait for a certain time, and after that time have elapsed, during the same time while they are waiting, maybe a year or more, after that they are dead, have died, right? They would wait, maybe sow and harvest, and after sowing and harvesting, the crops that they would harvest, they would then gather every of his relative together so that they can then perform the activities that are supposed to be done to facilitate his resurrection. It's the same again with the purpose of the doctrine, to say we are going to gather of every man's part, right? Paul was ministering a part, Moses was ministering a part, Jesus came and taught and ministered a part which he would fulfill on his returning, right? So all these parts would be gathered together. Islam also, it ministered a part. So all these parts would be gathered together, which is also somehow synonymous to the gathering of all the relatives together, right? So that it can facilitate the resurrection of their dead. It's the same concept. We are supposed to gather all religions together in understanding, in knowledge. So it's an epistemic era. It's an era of understanding God through knowledge or through interpretation of that which was done of man, or through telling man that which he was doing, that which was being done in Islam, that which was being done in the administration of apostles and other ministrations. All of it coming together would actually represent, or would actually be suffice to give us a coding that should resurrect our dead. So we are going to see that what I've done so far, I've introduced the resurrection of the dead as a concept, and where it was demonstrated so that you can be somewhat clear in your understanding concerning the resurrection of the dead. But now I want you to brace yourself to for the other section, wherein I want to introduce now part and portion of the scripture where Jesus would teach concerning the resurrection of the dead. This is going to be a bit lengthy because I'm sure I will introduce it in this section, then maybe explore it further in the other section that follow. So within this section, I'm going to introduce how Jesus was teaching concerning the resurrection of the dead. Because now I've explained it and I've given an example through the abundance, of course, of the gifts of God which He gave us. That which He gave us through the African tradition would help us understand the concept. And now we have the concept, we now have the teachings from Jesus, where and how it was demonstrated to show the resurrection of the dead. So you are going to see that I introduced the law of love, and I said the scripture actually says it's a great commandment, or charity actually covers many sins, meaning to say it was the ultimate law which would govern and guide mankind. That is to say, mankind were supposed to understand that they are earthy and they are supposed to give that which God blessed them inside, that which is natural, to give to that which is spiritual. They were supposed to gather for their spirit. They were supposed to gather for their brother. So now that I introduced, if I want you all to turn again to the introduction which I did, because in the introduction to the doctrine of Jesus Christ, I also explained to say men who came and ministered, that is religions appeared at different places in the trajectory which is time bound, right? So Moses would appear at his level, then at another level also you have Samuel, you have David. After that you have the captivity in Babylon. After also you also have Jesus coming. By the coming of Jesus, we would hear also of the ministration of the apostles. Then as we go, we would have a lot more other ministrations at their various places. So the ministrations which would come from God would actually happen at different places in time. Ministrations inside religions governed and guided of angels. They would happen at different places in time in the trajectory. So this means that the practice and exercise of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead would guide men at these levels wherever they are going to be ministering. First, the doctrine would guide their place. Secondly, it will guide their practice of religion. That is to give them laws. The laws themselves are responding, but also their location itself is also governed by the doctrine. So a location of a certain ministration would tell us their location according to the doctrine. Then whatever they would minister and give as traditions or as commandments, these also would be governed by their position also according to the doctrine, right? So we are going to hear that the practice of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead would be different at different places. At some point, the brother who is supposed to be loved according to that law, he can be referred to as a neighbor. At some point, he will be referred as a stranger. At another point, he will just be referred to as another. Then at some other point, you actually hear him being referred to as a brother, right? So all these things are actually a portrayal of how this doctrine was going to be managed inside the ministration of religions or inside the living. So inside the living, you would hear this practice of doctrine with different terms. So I'm reading from the book of Matthew chapter 1, where Jesus mentioned of the commandment of love. That is mentioned of the love that is supposed to be done to our dead brother, right? So Matthew chapter 22, verse 37, but let me read from verse 35. And one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him, saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? And Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So we are going to see that this first commandment is, or which was referred to as loving the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy mind, with all thy strength, with all thy soul in this case. It was a commandment which Jesus mentioned to say that it's actually the same as loving your neighbor as thyself. So the neighbor there is a brother, but at a different level of the trajectory inside the ministration of the religions. So ministrations under religion would happen at different stages. At a certain stage, a brother is actually a neighbor, right? Or is another, as I've spoken. So at this point, during the book of Matthew, Jesus is teaching to say another, but it's the same law. I'm going to show you later on as we are going to learn, but I just want you to know specifically that these books were not arranged in a random compilation. These books are specifically arranged in a trajectory mode, right? We are moving on a journey. So if you move from the book of Matthew to the book of Mark, to the book of Luke, to the book of John, it's a journey which we're traveling. They are not the same, these books. They are totally different and addressing men at different levels. Yeah. So let me also just submit to this which I've stated, which was taught of Jesus. It also means that if you love your neighbor or if you love your brother, you're actually loving God. You're actually submitting to loving God with all thy mind, with all thy heart, with all thy soul. So that means to say, if you are going to love your brother who have not yet resurrected, if you're going to work towards his resurrection, you're actually going to love God, because you are going to resurrect him, to give him a law, for him to be spiritual. And in those instances, once your spirit have resurrected, you are going to be loved of God. You are going to be able to love God, because God is spiritual and God is in heaven, right? The same again in the books of 1 John. You are going to hear John emphasizing to say you should love your brother so that God would love you. It means the same. If you love your brother, you resurrect your brother, then you can now relate with God. So it's the same. God was simply saying, I cannot relate with you by any means. I only must relate to you spiritually. Therefore, love your brother. Therefore, let you come to the resurrection of the dead. And by the resurrection of the dead, you are going to now relate with God, right? So that's very important, and it's going to help us understand certain aspects concerning that which God was also to show and demonstrate inside the ministration of the Gospels, because Jesus did taught extensively about this. And for now, I may tell you that the book of Luke is the book that was teaching about the resurrection of the dead. It's the book that was talking of the resurrection of the dead more often than any other book, right? So I want you to know that just because we have inside the living a portrayal of the dead as well, like I was showing in the model or in the diagram which I was teaching from, I did show that the living would actually be meant to do things inside the living, which would represent either the living or the dead, so that by that knowledge we are then going to know how we're going to gather the blessing, to gather the treasure, to order the testimony, so that we can resurrect our dead, right? So I will return now to that diagram and explain an aspect concerning what I will title the ministration of the resurrection of the dead. Yes, so now I want to introduce an aspect which is titled the ministration, which is called the ministration from the dead. But I won't introduce it initially. I will need to explain a lot more other things concerning the things that I wrote inside the living, right? So I remember mentioning that to you, to say the living were men of the earth, and therefore, being a man of the earth, they did not know of what had happened to them on their creation. Because they did not know, God had to portray it inside them, inside their lives, inside their diversifications, so that they can understand that which we have been spoken of God concerning the creation of all the living. So, the creation of all the living limited them because they did not know that their spirit was dead, right? But God would portray it inside their lives so that they can know the journey to resurrect their dead, right? To know that journey, men would have to partake in a lot of activities. And that is the long journey which was being spoken of by the scriptures, to say the journey is long. At some point in time, you would hear scriptures saying there is no end to the laboring of men. All is vanity. There are vanities, like vanity of vanities. And also you hear them saying the men cannot number his sorrows. The sorrows of men were going to be plenty. All that explains the journey through which man was going to now take, so that he can then resurrect his dead. The journey involved a lot of religions, it involved a lot of stations. That is, sometimes you can actually begin to say from Moses, the prophets, from the prophets, Jesus ministering and telling us of his coming back again, of his return. Then before that, his return, you would hear also the apostles, from the apostles, You would hear also the Quran itself. But still, all this work would also be supplemented by many other vain activities practiced inside religions, the Roman mythology, the Greek mythology, the Anglo-Saxon mythology, and the various other religions, the African tradition as well. These religions would labor so that we can actually come to the fullness of understanding. We can actually come to the full gathering of the blessing. This is the blessing, which is the seed, which is the priesthood, which is also the one, like the gathering into one of the blessing, so that we can achieve the resurrection of the dead. Or we can answer to the purpose of God in giving the blessing to the living. That is, he sowed a seed. That's why he loved Jacob. He loved Jacob. He sowed a seed out of Jacob. And that seed would resurrect his dead brother out of the acts of charity or out of the acts of love, right? Practice it at various places. So now, to explain further this which I have written here, I said men discovered that when they were left on the earth, right, they became diversified. Man was divided into races. Man was divided into tribes. Man was divided into many ethnic groups, right? All that division which then ensued after man came from one seed, from the living soul of Adam. After all that we were born of one, we then were made to be diverse. The diversifications are trying to preach to us. I'm using simpler models here so that we can all get acquainted to that which God is doing or to that which God did among us, right? And these terms that I'm writing inside here, there are terms that are used inside the scriptures or even inside the Quran or in other writings which God did inspire through many other messengers which came from God. I will show you of all those things later on in the progression. But first, we should be rooted in the doctrine, because the doctrine answers all that diversification of messages which came from God. So, you are going to see that men being divided, as I said, into races, into different ethnic groups, that would inspire these terms that I've written here. Men would minister first among the living. So you're going to see that these two, they're actually the living. The living are the living among the living, which is Israel, Judah, right? And maybe other, which I will add. Then there is also the living who are among the dead. These are the Gentiles, which means the Greeks, the Romans, and so they all would be classified as the Gentiles. So this portion would represent the living, and this other portion would represent the dead, right? So ministrations of the gospel would take these forms. First, the gospel would be ministered among the living. Then, after that, it had been ministered among the living, and the seed having been established, this same gospel, after such a time, according to the determinations of God, according to the guidances given of the angels of God, that same message would come to the dead. So these who are titled to be dead would actually sort of resurrect, and after resurrecting, as a portrayal of the resurrection, they would preach of the resurrection. And when they preach of the resurrection, they are actually bringing every part, every portion together. And when that ministration have completed its work, it's actually supposed to inspire the resurrection of our dead. That would be the last ministration to then resurrect our dead. In simpler terms, I'm saying the ministration which would resurrect the dead would come from those who are representing the dead among the living. These are not really the dead, but they are the dead because men, remember, I'm saying men are earthy. We know we can only see things which are natural. We can understand things according to our nature. We are natural men. We can't see that which is spiritual. Therefore, just because we can't see that which is spiritual, among us there were people who were portraying the dead in terms of their race and ethnic identity. Their identity would represent they which are living, they which are dead, some representing they which are living, some representing they which are living among the dead. All these terms are actually terms then which can be coined now by me, simplified here in this diagram, but also they are also in the scriptures. I will show you where these terms are as we continue to learn about the resurrection of the dead. But there is nothing complicated there. Nothing complicated. I'm just saying, men who are the living, we are all of the earth. We are all earthy. We were all born of one father, right? We are all coming from Adam, who is a living soul. We don't understand things which are dead or which are living. We only know one. We only know ourselves. We should then know that ourselves, we are the living, then they are the dead. Then from the dead, we should then understand that which God is saying. God is saying we should resurrect our dead, which are truly our spirit. So before that we can understand all that, we should have these, the living and the dead, portrayed among the living, right? So races on earth today, they took this form in their distribution, right? So I can actually tell you certain things which are realities of the world which people didn't know about, right? You are actually going to see that if you take the equator dividing the earth into two, everything that falls under the equator would represent the dead. Everything that is above the equator, the sides which are above the equator to its north, all those sides would represent the living, right? So that's why even the ministration of the apostles would happen also to the known world. The other world was discovered, I think in the 17th century there, when the Americas were discovered, and later on other parts through the works of Christopher Columbus and other sailors, which they then started to document the known world. Anything else other than the known world. But the known world is actually the living, it's representing the living. So actually, as I have noted here, the ministrations which happened among the apostles, early apostles, we actually only received Israel and Judah, then the ministrations among the Gentiles. Then also, yes, I know there's an introduction of the barbarians there, but the barbarians, I will also help you out later on to show you how much those barbarians still were actually just representing the living, right? But everything of that ministration which happened there, it happened among the living. So this, what I've just shown and demonstrated, it's going to tell us of something that is special, which I wanted to introduce. The ministration which would come from the dead, right? These things are exactly what the scriptures say. To say the true resurrection is going to come from the dead, right? That is, the dead who are among the living, they are the ones who are supposed to give the true resurrection. We are going to see that the book of Revelation chapter 20 would actually portray the resurrection as it was seen of John as things which would happen hereafter, right? Which would happen after the ministration which was done among the living. And that resurrection, if you're going to read the book of Revelation chapter 20, you are going to see that such a resurrection would only happen among the dead. So the dead were brought to be judged of God, and the dead would resurrect, right? That sort of ministration, it only represented the dead. So it was actually a prophecy to say the resurrection or the seed which would bring the true resurrection of our spirit unto a heavenly time would happen later on in the times of the ministration which would come from they which are dead, right? And these are the things that Jesus was trying to tell or to teach about concerning the ministration which was more superior, because remember, these ministrations, they actually translate through time. The ministration which would happen among Israel and Judah would be less glorious than the ministration which would happen among the Gentiles. The same again with the ministration which would happen among the dead. In its power, the ministration which would happen among the dead, according to the books of Revelation, it would bring the resurrection of the dead. And it is the ministration which would be spoken of by Paul during the ministration among the living to say he is waiting for the resurrection of the dead. Or in other words, he would promise to say the dead are going to resurrect. So that ministration is more superior also in its efficacy, in terms of its ability to resurrect the dead, in terms of its ability to then generate the ultimate required seed that was wanted, right? So let me move on now to then explain and show by demonstration how then this ministration is going to come out, the ministration which was promised, the ministration from the resurrection of the dead. I'm going to show how Jesus taught about it extensively, how it was promised, how it was prophesied of inside the scriptures, and also to tell you more about that ministration as guided by the resurrection of the dead as a doctrine. Because the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead is the doctrine that gives birth to such terms as the ministration which would happen among the dead. Yes, so what I'm going to do now is, since I've shown you that men themselves being the living, inside the living, men would be demarcated, men would be diversified through various forms so that they can represent that which had been spoken to their spirit, that which had been spoken in them being earthy initially, so that they can understand that they need to gather the blessing, and their gathering of the blessing would take them to have a message which should resurrect their dead. But however, the message which would resurrect their dead would not be complete if it had not been mimicked inside they which are titled to be dead, right? Like I said, inside the living, there are some which are going to be titled the living, some the living among the dead, some the dead, some the living, the dead who are already dead, right? But for the efficacy of the message to be complete and powerful enough to resurrect he who is dead, that ministration should first work out something which seemingly is dead, which men can know, can see and relate with, right? So you're actually going to see that human race, as they are spread upon the earth, the blacks themselves, they which would be found on the southern part of the hemisphere, also, they would represent the dead. And the other portions, all of them which falls under the line of altitude or the equator, right? That line of altitude would actually represent the living and the dead. Or actually it would represent where God intended for to bring the ministration which is going to bring the resurrection of the dead. And that ministration, as I have described before, is the ministration which is the gathering of all men together, or the gathering of all knowledge together, so that men can resurrect. But these things were shown and taught of Jesus through many diversified dimensions, but still it being one and the same thing. So as I have shown and explained to you in stating, the book of Luke is the book which would actually portray all these things. First, it is the book that would preach from the mother of Jesus' perspective. Not the perspective per se. I'm not going to use perspective for now. I think, let me just say, it's the perspective of the resurrection of the dead, right? I will explain these things later on as we go. Here we're just introducing the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead so that we can appreciate and see the purpose and also the stages that would happen in the preaching of the gospel, at least to have an appreciation that would then solidify all the other doctrines into one, right? So let me read now Jesus himself teaching, since this doctrine of the resurrection of the dead is a principle of the doctrine of Jesus Christ, right? So I want now to demonstrate where Jesus did show through his teaching the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. I'm reading the book of Luke from verse 25. I'll read from verse 25 up to verse 32, right? From verse 25, and there went great multitudes with him, and he turned and said unto them, if any man come to me, and hate not his father, and mother, and wife, and children, and brethren, and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whosoever doth not bear his cross, and come after me, cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, sitteth not down first, and counteth the cost, whether ye have sufficient to finish it, lest haply, after he hath laid the foundation, and is not able to finish it, all that behold it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build, and was not able to finish. Or what king going to make war against another king, sitteth not down first, and consulteth whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is yet a great way off, he sendeth an embassage, and desireth conditions of peace. So likewise, whosoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath, he cannot be my disciple. Right? So I have read up to verse 33, specifically to add another portion, which I saw it fitting also to the discussions of the doctrine. So I will start from verse 25, where I just read that Jesus had actually saw. Okay, that's fine. So I will check first the words which Jesus spake from verse 25. This is Luke chapter 14, verse 16. Luke chapter 14 from verse 25 to verse 33, where I've read. You are going to see that on verse 25, the multitudes were coming to Jesus, right? But Jesus had to tell people something concerning his ministration. In other words, he was stating a law which would govern they which would come from the living side to come to the dead side. Or simply, he was just simply stating what would happen to the ministration which would be done among the living, when then the same ministration should be usable among the dead. That is, when the ministration from the dead would come, what is it that he's going to do, say, from the ministration that he's going to receive of Apostle Paul, of the ministration done inside the Quran, for instance? All those things were done among the living. But now, when those things were going to come to the dead side, Jesus had to teach what will happen. In this case, he was answering to a multitude. And I'm saying these things were taught inside the book of Luke, because the book of Luke is the book which would prophesy of that which would happen among the dead, or it would prophesy of the resurrection, of the ministration which would happen among the dead, a ministration which would bring in the resurrection of the dead, right? By answering them now, he answered them in Proverbs. But in these Proverbs, I'm going to explain to you what he meant in all this in light of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, right? He was now saying, everything that had been done inside the living, it was going to be interpreted. In other words, it was going to be hated. People were not going to then follow it as it had been portrayed or as it had been stated. Things concerning that ministration were supposed to pass away. As said also the preachers, and you hear Apostle Paul saying that whatever that is in the ministration of men, it was going to pass away. If man says he knows anything, he knows nothing, then he ought to know. Man was prophesying in part or ministering in a part. If there be tongues or knowledge contained in the administration of men, they were all going to pass away. Men were waiting for the resurrection of the dead. Men were waiting for the glorious appearance of Jesus. That which they were doing or ministering would all pass away. That realization is that which Jesus was teaching here. So they were doing as Jesus had actually taught them. That after they were done, they were in their doing of the ministration of among the living, that ministration had to be understood, also be prepared to be compatible with the ministration which would come from the dead. Jesus had taught about it. That's why he said, no, you should hate your father, your mother, your children. And these are just dimensions inside the ministration. Father, mother, they're just dimensions. You know about them. You're actually going to hear in the book of 1 John, John teaching and saying, I'm saying this to you little children, I'm saying this to the fathers, I'm saying this to the young men. And the other books also, you hear Paul mentioning of widows, you hear him mentioning of children. All these were dimensions and components within a ministration. You are going to learn of these components. They are actually going to be brought to light through the doctrine. But however, for now, you don't need to get into those details. But just understand that whatever that was in that ministration of the living or among the living would actually be done away with. In this case, Jesus used the word hate, right? You should hate that ministration. For truly, the things that are contained in that ministration, they are now just the traditions or commandments of men to be interpreted by the doctrine, not to be taught as it were to represent the doctrine. So then Jesus is now answering verse 27, and whosoever that do not bear his cross and come after me, he cannot be my disciple. Then he give an example of a man who is building a tower. He is simply trying to tell men that the building is not yet complete after the ministration among the living, right? It's not yet complete. This man is going to build, but in his building is going to include the ministration which is going to come from the dead, so that his work should be complete and finished. I am not living by this ministration which is going to be done among the living only. Else, people will mock me to say I failed to finish the building, right? The building should actually include the ministrations which would be done among the living, right? That's the proverb there that he used. You're also going to hear him also say, a man is meeting a king who is coming after him to war against him, and he has 10,000, but that king who is coming, he has 20,000. Then that man was being told, no, you're actually supposed to send embassies of peace, desiring peace, so that by desiring peace, you're actually going to be able to follow the law. This is the admonition which would go into the ministrations among the living. Apostle Paul himself understood it. He's sending embassies of peace is those prophecies wherein he prophesied of that ministration. when he said, I know in part, I prophesy in part. That which is perfect is going to come, right? He also said, man knows nothing, because the ministration among the living is the ministration titled men. It was going to pass away. It knew nothing than it ought to know, right? That's what he meant. So actually, Paul was following the doctrine. He was submitting to the doctrine because he knew he had to send those embassies of peace. And embassies of peace is the prophecies, is the messages stating that no, we are not yet come to the resurrection of the dead. The dead shall resurrect, right? That would happen among the dead. So all that we should also speak of in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, it actually sought to abide by that which was taught of Jesus concerning the building of the house, concerning the neglecting of the ministration done among the apostles or among the living, or else meaning to say that that ministration was supposed to be interpreted. All this was just submission. Also, the fact that you are going to see in the parable that the king that would come actually had more soldiers than he who was to contend with him. It only simply stated, it simply states to the fact that the ministration which would come from the dead, it was a better, more superior, more enlightened ministration. A ministration with the potency to actually resurrect the dead. So it was a better ministration. In other portions, it would be referred as the ministration of God. Because remember, the prophets which would prophesy would understand that the ministration which would come from the resurrection of the dead, it had a representation of godly ministration. That is, would have come out of the ministrations which were guided and superintended of angels, right? So you would hear that being given as a prophecy as well. I'm just adding Psalm chapter 68, verse 18, verse 17. The chariots of God are 20,000, even thousands of angels, and the Lord is among them as in Sinai in the holy place. So this is a statement also to just prophesy of that which would happen. It's the same number also used here by Jesus to represent the ministration which would happen among the dead. So here I've just used this teaching in Luke chapter 14, where I've just read is a portion, but I was just running it so that I can just give you the light concerning the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, now explained in light of the ministration that would happen among the dead, right? So this is the same teaching that would also be shown in the same book, the book of Luke. Maybe here I'm not going to be stating them specifically, but I'm just going to help you understand them, because these are the proverbs or teachings or parables that you heard and you already know about them. The same again with the parable of the prodigal son, shared in the following chapter in Luke chapter 15. It only sought to explain to men of the two ministrations. The son who stayed behind, he was ministering a ministration among the living. The son who would come after such a time of being maybe having done a wasteful life, and then later on resurrecting or coming back to the Father. That son would represent also the ministration that would happen among the living. So the ministration which would happen among the dead, was more superior, right? The ministration that would happen among the dead was more superior. It would come later on, and it would actually be more blessed, represented here in that parable, concerning the more sacrifices, concerning the more opulence in terms of the gifts that he was given of his father, and the celebrations that would then happen after he is come. And I want you to go to the last scripture of that parable. You actually get more enlightenment concerning the fact that this ministration would come from the dead. Yes, so you're actually going to see that, when I read this scripture, you're actually going to see that Jesus was just using diversifications to explain the same concept, but to make it much more understandable, for it to be entrenched inside the listeners, so that none would err the commandment, none would err the law of God, right? So let me read the last scripture in chapter 15 of Luke, of the book of Luke. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother was dead and is alive, and was lost and is found. So this is explaining the ministration which would come from the dead, right? It first portrays the resurrection of the dead, like what I mentioned when I was showing you on the board that time. So this brother was dead and is now alive. So he's now representing a ministration that would come from the resurrection of the dead. And that's the difference between the two brothers. He was extravagant. His extravagance and his servitude, it's simply explaining the servitude as I have tried to show inside Esau, that Esau will be a servant while the first ministration is in progress, or while the living are demonstrating the things that are spiritual, or demonstrating them ethically or naturally. During that time, that which is spiritual is a servant, right? So it's the same again with this brother. He would waste, just like Esau would actually sell his birthright to Jacob. It's the same concept, but we'll learn more about this concept. But I'm just giving you the light so that you won't get lost if you have the framework, or if you have the summary of how the scriptures were written, or how the Bible was written, right? So the book of Luke is the book that specifically explains the ministration which would come from the resurrection of the dead. You also hear the same being spoken of in the book of Luke chapter 16, Luke chapter 17, right? But these things, I'm sure I will then demonstrate to you as we go. I'm just seeking to give you the light, to give you some, somewhere to stand concerning the teachings which were given of Jesus, right? So I want you also to hear that which was spoken of Jesus in the book of Luke chapter 16. I'll read from verse 1 up to verse 9. This is a bit heavy, but don't worry about it. It's not really heavy, right? I will explain it easily because I've explained the certain portions before. I will use the portions which I've explained to explain the other portion. As I said, it's just a diversification of the same message being diversified forms so that it can be understood better, so that it can, hold better inside the listeners. So Luke chapter 16 for verse 1, and he said also unto his disciples, there was a certain rich man which had a steward, and the same was accused unto him that he had wasted his goods. And he called him and said unto him, how is it that I hear this of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest be no longer steward. Then the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my Lord taketh away from me the stewardship. I cannot dig. To beg I am ashamed. I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his Lord's debtors unto him, and said unto the first, how much owest thou unto my Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said unto him, take thy bill, and sit down quickly, and write 50. And then said he to another, and how much owest thou? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said unto him, take thy bill, and write 80. And the Lord commended the unjust steward, because he had done wisely. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when you fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations. Right? That's where I'll stop for now. But this same teaching from Jesus is also seeking to enlighten people concerning the coming of the ministration, which would come from the dead, right? The dead, the living are being told of it. They are being taught and instructed concerning that ministration. It simply means that this steward is the spirit which was working inside the ministration among the living, right? It sought to just state that whatever that was ministered among the living, it was not complete. It was a work in progress matter, right? As also said the apostles that no, we have not attained unto the resurrection of the dead. The resurrection of the dead is not past already. It shall happen from the dead, right? That is also what Jesus was teaching in the previous parable, which we read in Luke chapter 14, to say the tower was yet in building, right? He was not going to leave the tower unfinished. By putting a break having done only the ministration among the living, that is the ministration of the apostles, that would actually mean to say he had left the work unfinished, incomplete. The same again, it is now being portrayed here to say, no, this unjust steward, he is actually telling his Lord that whatever that was going to be done among the living was not complete. Otherwise, in other words, it was not enough, or it did not suffice the amount of the debt. The debt is bigger. The debt would actually be repayable upon the ministration which would come from the dead. Then we would achieve the resurrection of the dead. So by him cancelling the debt, it was all an act of the ministrations themselves. The ministrations, the Holy Ghost would actually represent that ministration as a partial ministration. Things of that ministration would pass away. It was not a perfect ministration. It didn't complete the debt. It didn't pay the debt in full, but the debt was going to be finished in full from the other end. That's why this unjust steward was commended. Being unjust, the term unjust steward, it simply means that he is working with nature. It's an earthly ministration. That's why he is said to be unjust. The just is that which is spiritual. The fact that we are still working inside that which is nature, that which is earthly, it means we are unjust. We are working that which is unperfect, as according to the words of Paul, right? It means being unjust as well, right? Whatever knowledge, whatever tongue, whatever prophecy that would be done in that ministration, it would pass away. Therefore, it is doing vain things, right? Things of the Spirit are represented in vain representations. Therefore, it is titled an unjust servant, right? The operations of the Holy Ghost. It's commendable because it would actually accomplish the work by bringing the ministration among the dead. So this also is an act where Jesus was teaching concerning the resurrection of the dead. Therefore, Jesus, what he taught was actually well followed and well obeyed of the apostles, because they understood that the true glory would come, right? People were supposed to wait for the mercies of God, as according to the book of Jude, to say we're waiting for the appearing of his mercies. At some point, you also hear them saying we are waiting for the resurrection of the dead. It's the same message, right? We're waiting for the resurrection. We're waiting to attain to that which is spiritual. The same again is echoed inside the Quran. The Quran states several times that they were working towards the resurrection, working towards the last day, working toward the gathering of all men together unto God. That is just a diversification of the same knowledge. However, diversifying it so that it adds, it spices the understanding so that the knowledge would be uncompromising, the knowledge would be complete and whole. So that's the introduction. That's so far. I will give you that so far. We will add more as we progress, because this doctrine, remember, we have a lot of things to be taught, a lot of things to be understood. So maybe for now, I'm going to seek later on to explain the things that I had mentioned in that diagram much more into detail, because I have worked around certain aspects that allows me now to work with those terms and give you a greater and a more clearer picture of what is it that we are learning concerning the resurrection of the dead. Yes, so I think just for now I will conclude this section. I don't want to heap up things that will not be understood. I want you to digest these things easily in the context of the things that I was saying. Hear my words, hear my explanations, my simplifications. They are necessary for our going forward. For you also to really appreciate how these things are being portrayed in the scriptures. Because these doctrines, there are many. Remember, there are 6 principles of the doctrine. We are just getting into them bit by bit as at an introductory level, and getting that framework. We are then going to be able to explore more, to explore further into the details of the doctrine itself, right? So that's how it is. What we have done today was to eventually show, according to the teachings which were then given of the Messiah, Jesus, that the ministration that would happen among the living was not complete. It would not actually give us the appreciation of the resurrection of the dead. Let it be portrayed first as a form of a ministration that would happen among they which are your dead, right? So that you understand how to resurrect your truly dead, right? That's why that ministration is necessary. It's the ministration that is going to bring the resurrection of the dead. So when it's coming from they which are tied with the dead among men, right? So as you have seen in the book of Luke chapter 16, it is folly to say that the debt is fully paid from the ministration which happened among the living. It is folly because even Paul himself, he acknowledged that no, not even. We are knowing nothing. That which is perfect shall come, right? We are a passing man. We are only prophesying our part. That is the part of the living, right? The other part of the dead would be done from among the dead. The same was being spoken by various other prophets. I mentioned of John in the book of Revelation, chapter 20, that the resurrection would happen from the dead, right? And judgment as well. You are actually going to see that the same will be echoed in various of Jesus' messages. And these Jesus messages, they would only be diversified one from another, because there are certain aspects that he would want to clarify from another parable, another aspect he would clarify from another parable, but sort of speaking the same thing, right? We are going to see that the alarm which was raising concerning the ministration which would come from the resurrection of the dead, first to say it would be stronger and superior, represented by the army. Secondly, it was a continuation of the building, represented by the building of the tower. Also the fact that it was a ministration that the former ministrations were supposed to prepare for. They were supposed to send a message for. They were supposed to prophesy of, right? They were supposed to teach of that ministration, because it was very important, right? And the other thing also, it is a ministration that was going to be much more joyous, much more acceptable before God, represented also by the coming of that dead brother who had went and squandered much of the treasures of his father. So it's all the same. But several dimensions are being brought in from one parable to another. And also in Luke chapter 16, it sought also to state that this ministration which would happen among the living, one, it was not complete in terms of payment of the debt. In that also sought to say would not have attained to the resurrection of the dead, or would still need another ministration to cleanse us of the sin, that is the debt which we had of God. The debt, the sin, it only represents our distant from that which is spiritual. Whenever we're still in a vain natural understanding, we're still inside our sins. That's why the debt there represented the sinfulness as well, as I'm saying. We would only clear the debt into the ministration which would come from the dead. So that's why Paul would actually say, no, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then we are all men most miserable, right? Then whatever effort that they would have done, it was all going to be fruitless. It was all going to be miserable, because it would not suffice to the payment of the debt, or to the attainment of true righteousness or cleanness, right? So that's what it meant. So you will see that I've just introduced the teachings of Jesus to show where he demonstrated the resurrection of the dead, right? Because it was not explicitly shown in the scriptures for special reasons. It's just because the time had not come for people to understand that, as it is mentioned, it would only happen from the ministration which would come from the resurrection of the dead. And that ministration would come in his time. And this is the time. We are going to show each other how and why we say this is the time, right? Later on. But for that which we have covered, we are very happy. I'm sure you are still with us. I will get a feedback from you to really understand if ever there are still glitches or so. But just try to set aside whatever falsehoods that you have received so far concerning the preaching of the gospel, because those are the things that are actually maybe, somewhat sending a confusion in you. It's the same things that are actually sending so much noises in your ears so that you cannot understand fully and completely what I'm explaining. I'm being very simple in my explanations. Also, maybe for now, assuming that everyone is at par with what we have spoken, everyone have understood, everyone is clean and clear, let me say the next section we're going to be looking into that which I represented in the chart or in the diagram, right, concerning the transitions which will happen then to say Israel, Judah, then the Gentiles, that's the Greeks and also the Romans, then later on the other side of the globe. I will seek to give you an understanding of these different nations in relation to the doctrine, because the doctrine is the one which should guide these nations, their religions, and their coming together eventually according to the will of God. Thank you.